So today we are going to talk about circles in the coordinate plane, and we're going to write equations in graph circles and then use that to solve problems. So just a quick review. The distance formula is kind of like the Pythagorean theorem because it's like a squared plus b squared equals c squared, but it's just kind of rearranged. And it is, distance equals the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. So the reason why this is kind of like the Pythagorean theorem is because this x2 minus x1 squared is kind of like a squared. This y2 minus y1 is kind of like b squared. And then even though d is not squared, we took the square root, and that is why it's kind of like Pythagorean theorem. So using this formula to find the distance between 2, 2 and 5, 7, don't let the x1 and x2 confuse you. It doesn't actually matter which order you do it. So we would have distance equals the square root of our x's subtracted, so 2 minus 5 squared, plus the difference in our y, so 2 minus 7 squared. And just make sure you're careful that you are actually doing your x's than your y's, because it's really easy to mix them up and do it in a different order. So always keep, if you start with the first ordered pair, always use that as your x1. If you start with the second, always start with the second. So d then equals the square root of negative 3 squared plus negative 5 squared. You can throw parentheses in there if you want. And the reason why it doesn't matter which order you do it in is because when you square it, then it becomes positive 9 plus 25. So then 9 plus 25 is 34, so our distance is the square root of 34. And to get that as a decimal, square root of 34 is, trying to use the calculator, and I have fat fingers apparently. And that is 5.83, and it's 830, so it is just straight 83. So the actual equation of a circle, if you want the theorem for the book, it is 12-7-1. And the equation of the circle with center hk and radius r is x minus h squared plus y minus k squared equals r squared. So just a couple things to notice. The center is a positive h, and we have a negative h. So because that is opposite, just know when you have your equation, it is going to be the opposite of whatever's inside the parentheses. And then we have k, and again, just like the h, it's going to be opposite. And then last but not least, you have your radius. Let's do orange, and the radius is also squared. So just keep in mind what each one does. So if we look at part A and we want to write an equation for a circle with center at 2, 2 and a radius of 5, because I know I'm going to have to square that, I'm just going to say r squared is 25, because then I can already have the number. I don't have to think about it anymore. So then to write the equation, it's always x minus whatever value is there. So since that's a 2, it's x minus 2 squared plus y minus always another 2. So 2 squared equals r squared, which is 25. And that is all you have to do for that. Okay? So if I wanted to write an equation for circle P with a center at P of 0, negative 3, and radius 8, again, if you want, you can say, hey, my r squared is 64. That way you already have the number. And then, I don't know why it just dinged like that. But then, to write it, we would have x minus 0 squared, which, think about it, x, whoa, what in the world just happened? Well, we're just going to wait for it to reload. It's thinking. And, all right, 12.7. That's weird. All right, so now that we're back, so strange. With that x minus 0 that you just saw, even though it just disappeared, because it's x minus 0, you can just leave it as x squared. That's totally fine. Plus y minus, since that's a negative 3, I'm just going to change this to plus 3, because remember, minus negative 3 would be a positive 3. And then that is still squared, and then 64 would be by itself on this side. Okay, so it is that whole thing. So for circle K, this one passes through 6, 4, and has a center at 1, -8. So this one's going to take a little bit more thought process. So the reason why this point helps us is because we can find the radius. So what I like to do is just write the equation and leave some space to write it. So because my center is at 1, -8, I'm going to have x minus 1 squared plus y minus -8. So minus -8 makes it a positive 8 squared equals r squared, which we don't have the radius yet. So to get the radius, I'm going to come over here in dark blue, boop, and give myself some space. And I'm going to use the distance formula. So distance is the square root of your x values and your y values, and you're just going to do your center to whatever point it passes through. So 6 minus 1 squared plus 4 minus -8 squared, which would just be a big fat positive. Positive. So then 6 minus 1 is 5. 4 plus 8 is 12. So then we have square root of 25 plus 144, which tells us that that is the square root of 169, which if we actually do that, the distance would be 13. Now, keep in mind the distance is 13, which is the radius, because we went from the center to a point that the circle went through. So because my radius has to be squared, it's just going to be 169. And quick little hint, if you notice inside the radical that is your radius squared, then you can just take that number out. Okay? So looking at the next one, we have that circle Q passes through 2, 3, and has a center at 2, -1. So again, I'm just going to write what I can so far. So x minus 2 squared, it's always opposite, plus y minus -1 makes it a positive 1 plus 1. And then to find the radius, we have to do distance formula again. So distance equals the square root of your x's plus your y's subtracted. So 3 minus 1 would become 3 plus 1. So then that would be 0 squared plus 4 squared, which don't really care about that 0 squared, so it's just the square root of 16, which would be 4. Again, that is your radius, and I'm pointing this out just in case you need that piece of information, even though technically my radius squared is right here, so it's going to be equal to 16. Okay? So, looking at this, we want to know what is the connection between the distance formula and the equation of the circle. And if you think about it, I'm going to write them both. Distance is the square root of x minus, we'll do x2, there we go, plus y2 minus y1 squared. And the formula for a circle is x minus h squared plus y minus k squared, and actually let me fix that k, equals r squared. So if you notice, they do look really similar, and that h is also an x value, and the k is a y value. So really everything's the same but that radical, but if you take the square root of that radius, now, and I'm going to flip it so that you can see it a little bit easier, radius is going to be the square root of x minus h squared plus y minus k squared. So they're actually the exact same formula pretty much. And so just keep that in mind. And I don't really have a good picture to draw on the grid, but what I will say is if we're going to graph, let's say we had a circle at x squared plus y squared equals, let's say 16. Because this is a radius squared, my radius is 4. So I would just plot my point at 0, 0, and then count 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4 in every direction. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then to the best of your ability, you just kind of draw a circle through those points. Okay? So, in order to graph, when you are given an equation of a circle, you can graph it by making a table or by identifying its center and radius, kind of like I just did. So if you notice, if I were to make a table for this x squared plus y squared equals 16, they pick -4, -3, -2, 0, 2, 3, and 4. And you notice they have a lot of decimals, and I generally don't really like decimals. They did plot these points, but again, I generally just kind of hate them. And the reason why these are plus or minus 2.6, plus or minus 3.5, plus or minus, is because when you take that square root, it's the positive or negative version. But for me, that trying to fill in a table is just too much work. It is much easier just to put it on the graph. So we just graphed this, and I didn't realize it was the exact same one when I came up with it off the top of my head. But x squared, y squared, the center is at 0, 0, and the radius is 4 because the square root of 16 is 4. So again, you put your point at the center, and then you count your radius out in all directions, up, down, left, and right. And just know I'm not as worried about the points that are 4 diagonally, like I'm not worried about is this distance exactly 4, as long as you have your radius in the straight directions, like up, down, left, and right. So, boop. So for these equations, we're going to list the center and radius because then you could very easily graph them if you wanted to. So for this first one, just to remind you of what the general rule for circles is, the center is HK, so it's opposite of whatever's there. And then in this case, our R is also R because, again, you're taking the square root of that side. So if we look at number 2, I have nothing with the x, so I know it's 0. And I have nothing with the y, so I know my center's at 0, 0. And then my radius is going to be the square root of 36, which is just 6. Okay? So, doing the next one. Boop. My center, because it's opposites, even though it looks like -3, it's going to be positive 3, positive 3. And then my radius is the square root of 4, which is 2. And by the way, you don't have to write this part in the middle as long as you know that it's the square root of that number. So for this one, again, opposites. My x, it says it's -3, so it's going to be a positive 3. And with the y, it's a positive 3, so it's going to be a -3. And then the radius is the square root of whatever's over there. So we have 1 for this one. Okay? For number 5, we have nothing with the x, so that is 0. And we have a positive 2 with the y, so the opposite would be -2. And then the radius is the square root of 81, which is 9. Okay? So then, for this one, my center opposite would be positive 7 and 0 because nothing's with the y. And then the radius is the square root of 9, which is 3. Okay? So, in order to graph these, some of you, it may be better off if you try and list your center and your radius. So for me, center is, or well, for all of us, the center is at positive 3, -4. So I'm going to go right 3 and down 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then, because of this number, my radius is 3, because the square root of 9 is 3. So then in every direction, I'm going to go up 3 from the center. So 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And 1, 2, 3. And again, this is from the center of the circle that you are counting in left, right, up, and down. Okay? So for this one, my center is at 0, 0, and my radius is still 3. So I would have my center smack dab in the middle, and then my radius being 3, I would go up, down, left, and right 3. So, and again, you're just connecting the dots as best as you possibly can. Okay? So, last but not least, we have this beautiful one, and our center, again, opposite would be positive 3 and -2. and our radius is 2. So we'd come right 3, down 2 for our center. And then from the center, count up 2, left 2, down 2, right 2. And then just connect all your dots as best as you can. And that is basically it for circles on a coordinate plane. The homework is at the bottom, so if you have questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, this is the last video that you will have to watch for notes. The rest are just going to be for review. Woo woo! Almost the end of the year.